It began with a deep rumble beneath the sea, violent, sudden, impossible to ignore. Within minutes, waves the size of buildings surged toward Japan's northeastern coast. Entire towns were torn apart, roads vanished, thousands of lives were lost in an instant. And then as the water receded, a new threat emerged, a nuclear power plant on the verge of catastrophe. This wasn't just one disaster, it was a chain reaction that plunged a nation into chaos. Whole cities were left in ruins, families were shattered, survivors faced bitter cold, broken infrastructure, and unbearable loss. Yet even in the darkest hours, there were stories of resilience, of those who stayed behind to warn others, of strangers saving strangers, of communities determined to rebuild from absolutely nothing. This is the story of the Tohoku earthquake, the disaster that reshaped Japan, and the people who refused to be broken by it. At 2:46 p.m. on the 11th of March 2011, an ordinary Friday afternoon in northeastern Japan was shattered by one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded. In the city of Sendai, the metropolis closest to the epicenter, people recall an eerie stillness just before the ground convulsed. Quote, "I've never felt something like this. I thought we were going to die." That's resident Mark Avicina, before adding, "There was an unusual silence, like the world had stopped, and then the earthquake started, and it was very long. It felt like it went on forever." Even hundreds of kilometers away in Tokyo, renowned for its earthquake-resistant skyscrapers, office towers swayed violently. Jide Obadina, then residing in the city, described a roaring noise as buildings shook and pieces of ceiling fell, followed by panicked workers pouring into the streets and parks, fleeing as alarms blared. In Japan, a nation very well drilled in seismic safety, everyone knew immediately that this was no routine tremor. For an agonizing 5 minutes, the seismic upheaval continued as the ongoing megaquake ruptured a 280-mile section of the Pacific Fault off of Honshu, Japan's largest island, thrusting the seabed upward by as much as 80 feet and displacing unfathomable quantities of water. Buildings crumbled, roads split apart, and the electricity snapped out across wide areas. Yet in many coastal towns of the Tohoku region, the northernmost part of Honshu, the worst was still to come, as no sooner had the shaking subsided than sirens and loudspeakers began to cry out once again. Now there was a warning of an incoming tsunami. Japan's meteorological agency issued its highest alert within 3 minutes of the quake. Along the coast, automated PA systems urged residents to please head to higher ground. The very words echoed live by a young disaster management worker, 24-year-old Miki Endo, as she broadcast urgent warnings from the town hall in Minamasanriku. With that, residents, teachers, and office workers who had only just staggered out of swaying buildings now faced a race for the hills, and it was a race they didn't have long to finish. The first waves were already on their way, expected to strike within half an hour. As the waves neared Tohoku's shoreline, people saw the ocean pull back, uncovering seafloor. An ancient warning sign. Then on the horizon, a black line appeared and rapidly grew into a roaring wall of water. In some areas, the tsunami reportedly reached over 100 feet high, as an unnamed survivor later told Al Jazeera. Buildings were destroyed. Black, dusty smoke was thrown up. Then the tsunami swallowed up the smoke. It is believed to have first hit the shore at 3:10 p.m., a mere 24 minutes after the start of the earthquake, and immediately it surged over embankments and rushed through city streets. In many places, there was little time to escape. In Sendai, Editha Avancina, Mark's mother, recalled how, quote, "the water entered the house with such force that it broke all the windows." As she and her family were engulfed by freezing seawater, they held each other and said their goodbyes, believing that this was the end. Further north in the fishing town of Rizuzen-Takata, a small city of barely 25,000 people, civil servant Takako Suzuki followed her community's emergency plan and ran to the designated tsunami evacuation building, the 3-story local civic center. But the wave there was over 45 feet high, an extreme that had simply not been accounted for. Quote, "Black water broke into the building through the windows with a rumbling noise, and I was just helplessly tossed around by the water. I don't even remember how I was swept along." In an instant, cold, debris-laden seawater filled the structure. Suzuki and a cluster of others were flung into an upper-floor room where the water kept rising until it was only inches from the ceiling. She clung to the floating wreckage, struggling desperately to keep her face in those few inches of breathable air. Quoting her again, "I was thinking if the water rises a little bit, I'm finished." But fortunately, the water suddenly stopped rising, and it began receding. End quote. Like thousands of others that day, Takako Suzuki had come within a whisker's width of death, yet somehow, through pure fluke of fate, survived Not everyone, however, was so lucky. In town after town, the designated safe evacuation sites, gyms, schools, community centers on supposed high ground, proved tragically insufficient against the unprecedented heights of the waves. Back in Minasanraku, where Mimi Endo had been so valiant and diligent in raising the alarm, dozens of officials and citizens had taken refuge on the roof of the 3-story disaster management center, only to watch the tsunami pour over their seawall and slam into the building itself. For a few moments, they could only stare as their entire townscape was engulfed in churning black seawater. Steel girders groaned and concrete structures were yanked from foundations. The people on the roof of the disaster center were soon fighting for their lives as the torrent swamped even the top floor. Mayor Jinsato, who had been inside, barely survived by clambering up a radio antenna, clinging to it with every bit of strength that he could muster. Quoting him, "I think I was underwater for 3 or 4 minutes." Others on the roof tried to hang on to railings, but many were washed away in the relentless surges that continued for hours. Of the 30 or so people who had initially reached that rooftop, only 10 were still alive the next morning. Among the missing, tragically, was Miki Endo. She had kept broadcasting the warning until the very last second, her transmission only ending when water rushed into the control room, short-circuiting her equipment and carrying her away before the building itself collapsed shortly after. Her body would not be found until over a month later, though her gallantry undoubtedly saved countless lives. In another valley, 2 elderly women, Mitsuka Koshi and Shizuka Hoshi, managed to survive only by climbing up onto a hillside Shinto shrine. Yet even there, the water rose to their waists. Gripping a stout tree with all of their strength as the currents tried to yank them away, the pair endured the surge until it finally receded. Teichi Fujiwara, Koshi's son and Hoshi's son-in-law, said there's no way they'd have survived if they lived down there, gesturing toward a lowland neighborhood. He continued, "You go 10 miles in every direction, and there are no people left." His blunt words underscored the grim reality. In some coastal districts, almost no one survived the tsunami. The waves had scarred these communities off the map, leaving behind nothing but splintered remains of buildings, piles of debris, and an unbearable human toll. When the sea finally withdrew that dreadful afternoon, the world that remained was unrecognizable. Trucks and houses lay swept aside like children's toys, and the living were left to comb through a wasteland of mud and rubble for those who had been lost. In the space of a few terrifying hours, entire cities and towns along a 300-mile stretch of Japan's Pacific coast had been devastated. And the death toll, when it's all said and done, well, that was tallied at 19,759 people, in addition to a further 2,553 whose remains were never found and are presumed dead, for a total of 22,312, as per the 2011 Great East Japan Earthquake Report number 162, published by Japan's Disaster Countermeasures Headquarters. In city after city, those who did survive emerged to scenes of biblical destruction. Some neighborhoods had been reduced to vast plains of splintered wood, twisted metal, and overturned vehicles, stretching out to a shoreline now utterly changed in shape. Fires also raged in several ports, ignited by ruptured gas lines or oil tanks. This was particularly bad in Kesanuma, where a towering inferno fed by drifting oil lit up the night sky and burned entire districts that the wave had not already erased. Amidst all of that wreckage, dazed survivors began to search frantically for missing loved ones. Many were covered in mud and shivering from shock and exposure, but they barely noticed their own cuts and bruises. Parents screamed the names of children who had not been seen since the wave hit. Elderly couples clung to each other in tears, scanning the piles of debris that had been their neighborhood for any sign of friends and family. Among them was Yoshihito Sasaki, a 60-year-old school principal who wandered the ruins of Rikuzentakata looking for his wife and son, knowing in his heart that they must be gone. Tragically, that suspicion was later vindicated. Speaking on the matter 10 years later, he simply said, "I thought maybe time would solve things, but I know now that's not the case." In that same city, which lost almost 1/10 of its population, those who survived did so often just by pure chance. Emika Chiba, for example, a 42-year-old resident whose small car was picked up by the wave instead of being crushed beneath it, was found alive by a passerby and guided to refuge on higher ground. She later returned with her husband to retrieve a few personal items from their smashed vehicle: a thermos, an umbrella, a family photo. Her face dark with shock. Her husband said, "It's like a bad dream. It's a nightmare." In the hardest hit areas, immediate rescue efforts were next to impossible. Roads, they were destroyed or clogged with debris, and vast tracts of land were just still underwater. It wasn't long before local residents themselves began acting as first responders. Those who were able pulled the injured onto makeshift rafts or doors serving as stretchers. They formed search parties to probe the debris for anyone trapped or calling out. In countless instances, these survivor rescuers saved neighbors and strangers alike in those crucial first hours. But they also faced heart-wrenching situations. In one shattered village school, an unnamed young mother joined firefighters combing through the rubble into the night, convinced she could hear the faint cries of children, her daughter amongst them calling for help in the darkness. She never found her daughter alive, and the memory of those unanswered cries continues to haunt her to this day. As the sun set on the 11th of March, Japan's northeast faced a night of profound anguish. Temperatures plunged toward freezing, and a light snow began to fall over some of the worst-hit areas. The tens of thousands who had evacuated to hilltops and shelters now shivered through the dark in wet clothes, many having lost shoes and coats while fleeing. There was no heat, no light, and for many no shelter beyond what could be improvised from salvaged blankets or tarpaulins. Aftershocks continued to rattle the region every few minutes too, some strong enough to send people scrambling for higher ground all over again. In the pitch-black evacuation centers, usually school gymnasiums or community halls that had been spared, people huddled together for warmth, spending the whole night alert and awake, jumping at each tremble, worried not only about another tsunami, but also about those still missing. So, out at sea, the tsunami was still reverberating. Multiple waves struck the Tohoku coast through the evening and into the night, some smaller, some nearly as large as the first. In Minamasariku, waves continued to inundate the low-lying areas repeatedly for hours, preventing any rescue attempts until well after midnight. Further north, in Rikuzen Takata's Civic Hall, Takako Suzuki and a group of survivors waited in total darkness on the flooded upper floor, the air freezing and foul with mud. Quote, "The building lurched because it was still filled with water, and aftershocks kept shaking the building, causing debris to fall down on us. That was scary." She would later say, "It's a mystery how I'm still alive." At the worst moments, tossed about by the tsunami, she had truly thought she was going to die and could only hang on for the sake of her children. Quote, "I'm a mother of 3, so I was holding up through it only by thinking that I wanted to see my children again." With first light on the 12th, salvation finally began to trickle through as local disaster responders had spent the night frantically plotting navigable paths into affected areas, be it over land, what was left of it, or straight over the floodwaters. That same day, they also began to be joined by reinforcements from all over Japan. Some 100,000 of the Japanese Self-Defense Forces personnel, which equated to 43% of the entire military, were mobilized, alongside countless police, firefighters, and medical teams from across the country. The first to arrive came by helicopter, buzzing over the flattened towns and plucking stranded survivors from rooftops and hillside perches. It was from one of these helicopters that Suzuki and the others at the Ritsukantaka Civic Center were finally plucked to safety, incidentally, nearly 24 hours after the first wave hit. Amid the overwhelming tragedy they had to confront head-on, there also emerged a few astonishing stories of survival. In the leveled city of Ishinomaki, for example, 9 days after the tsunami, rescuers digging through rubble were stunned to discover an 80-year-old grandmother and a 16-year-old grandson still alive under the ruins of their house. The pair had been trapped in their kitchen when the home collapsed. They survived on yogurt, sweets, and Coca-Cola from the refrigerator, bundled together under blankets against the cold. Eventually, the teenager managed to claw his way to the roof, where he attracted the attention of a search team. But while such stories provide a direly needed silver lining to this story, ultimately, they're just that. Silver linings. Exceptions. For most families, all a new day brought them was a new chance to have that worst fear confirmed, that their missing loved ones were never going to be coming home. Accordingly, and with the confirmed death toll already having climbed well into the thousands come the 12th, ad hoc morgues began to be set up in any decently sized building still left standing in order to handle the grim task of identifying bodies. It was a human cost that defied comprehension. Mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, neighbors, gone. And behind every victim, a story of heartbreak. A young father who had managed to evacuate his family to safety, only to be caught himself when he returned to fetch the dog. An elementary school class that evacuated to a hill, only to be swallowed by a black wave that reached even there. An elderly hospital ward that could not evacuate in time. Patients and nurses perishing together as water filled the corridors. The Great East Japan Earthquake, as it's known in Japan, would become the country's worst humanitarian disaster since World War II. No ifs, no buts, no close seconds. And yet, even as Japan reeled, another, very different, and potentially even more destructive crisis still was unfolding in parallel, one that had begun at the exact moment the tsunami struck, and which would bring its own haunting legacy. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant sat 60 miles or so south of Sendai, right on the seafront, having been built there very specifically to make use of the Pacific's near-endless supply of water for cooling purposes, and that position, well, it put it right in the path of the tsunami. It had actually withstood the initial earthquake very well, with the facility's 6 reactors having shut down automatically when the first tremors were detected, exactly as they had been designed to do in such scenarios, with emergency diesel generators then kicking in to keep vital cooling systems running. Instead, it was the tsunami that brought the facility to the edge of oblivion. Not that they hadn't taken precautions, mind you, because as the plant's nearly 19-foot-tall seawall could vouch, they absolutely did. It just wasn't enough, with the nearly 50-foot-tall wave that hit it simply stepping over that seawall as if it wasn't even there. It hit at 3:30 p.m., and within minutes the entire facility was flooded, including the basement that houses those emergency diesel generators. In an instant, the entire facility went dark, and the reactors that were fully operating that day, Units 1, 2, and 3, lost all cooling. What followed was a desperate struggle by the plant's operators to prevent a full-scale nuclear meltdown. In the frenzied hours after the wave hit, engineers improvised battery hookups and vented steam to reduce mounting pressure in the reactor vessels. But without stable cooling, the reactor cores began to overheat uncontrollably, and soon meltdown became an inevitability for all 3 reactors. The exact moment that they transitioned from simply overheating to proactively melting down, well, that's hard to pinpoint, but the Tokyo Electric Power Company, operators of Fukushima, stated in their post-accident analysis that the first to make that terrible transition was Unit 1 at 6:50 p.m. on the 11th. Unit 3 would be next, entering meltdown at 9 a.m. on the 13th, followed by Unit 2, which held out until 7:20 p.m. on the 14th. Evacuations around the plant, however, had begun almost immediately, though communications were chaotic. Initially, residents within 1.8 miles were told to flee, then those within 6.2 as the situation worsened. By the next day, the evacuation radius was widened to 12.4 miles, and when all was said and done, at least 164,000 people would hurriedly leave their homes. Many, just as their forerunners at Chernobyl had done decades prior, assumed they'd return in a couple of days once the plant was brought under control. The reality, though, was that some of their towns remain uninhabited to this very day. Back at the plant, things were going from bad to worse, as the zirconium cladding that lined the reactors had reacted with steam, producing hydrogen gas, and, well, that's really rather volatile, just in case you didn't know. As a result, explosions were imminent. The question wasn't if, it was when. And, well, the answer to that question turned out to be 3:36 p.m. on the 12th, as then a buildup of hydrogen gas blew the roof off of both Unit 1 and its encasing building, sending a plume of radioactive debris billowing straight up into the air. And then on the 14th, it happened again at Unit 3. Unit 2, however, through little but the grace of God, did not suffer such an explosion. The situation was now a calamitous one. All 3 reactors had melted down, their now liquid, superheated radioactive cores slowly burning their way out of containment. And in 2 of the 3, that exact same material was now billowing out into the atmosphere unabated. Japanese authorities and plant workers fought desperately to cool the reactors, to stop the meltdowns. Fire engines sprayed seawater, army helicopters dumped water from above, and engineers worked around the clock to lay new power lines. The world watched with held breath, fearing a catastrophe that could rival Chernobyl. Inside the plant, around 200 technicians, firemen, and soldiers endured extreme conditions to bring the crisis under control. This group, nicknamed the Fukushima 50 on account of the size of their shifts, remained at the reactor site despite high radiation, explosions, and risk of death. One supervisor later said they fully expected some of them would not come out alive, yet they felt a duty to protect their families and country from an even worse disaster. Thanks to their courage and a dose of luck, the reactors were eventually stabilized in the following weeks. By April, the government officially rated the Fukushima accident at level 7, the highest on the international scale, making it the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl in 1986. As for the death toll, as of the time of writing, Japan recognizes just one single death from the nuclear disaster, who, after an extensive trawl through Japanese language media, we don't believe has ever been named publicly, as well as a father of 2 who died during the initial earthquake. And undoubtedly, while tragic, it could have been so much worse, as pure fluke of nature meant that the wind happened to be blowing out to the Pacific Ocean that day. Ultimately, Japan had never faced a disaster like the Great Earthquake, not just in scale, but in complexity. In the immediate aftermath, over 465,000 people were displaced by a triple crisis: earthquake, tsunami, nuclear fallout. The national government, however, mobilized at speed, deploying tens of thousands of troops and emergency personnel and committing hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuilding efforts. Entire towns were relocated to higher grounds, and new seawalls nearly 50 feet tall were erected on an industrial scale. In cities like Rikuzentakata and Kensanuma, even the land itself was reshaped. Hills were leveled to make room for elevated housing, overlooking the now empty plains where their old neighborhoods once stood. By 2020, many new homes, schools, and shops had been completed, but the process of healing the victims was still far from complete. Thousands of survivors didn't return, whether due to trauma, economic reasons, or simply time passing. And as a result, many coastal towns remain smaller, older, and ultimately but an echo of their former selves. Those who remain haven't forgotten, however, and nor will they, because every year on the 11th of March, sirens wail at 2:46 p.m. all over Japan, and in affected towns, memorials stand, often engraved with names, footprints, and solemn vows to remember. In Rikuzentakata in particular, their memorial is particularly poignant as it is a single pine tree, a 250-year-old survivor that kept its roots planted when 70,000 others were flattened. Dubbed the miracle pine, it did eventually die from salt damage, but it was then preserved and replanted, where it remains to this day. And for survivors, of course, that day never fades. They remember the earth tearing apart beneath them, the black wave devouring their towns, the bitter cold of that first night, and the long, silent waits for news. For them, the 11th of March 2011 remains a defining moment, a line dividing everything into before and after. And yet, out of the wreckage, something enduring was built. Not just new homes or roads or seawalls, but something deeper, a shared understanding of what was lost and a quiet determination to honor it. For every mother who never found her child, for every town that vanished beneath the wave, for every life split into before and after, there was also the will to stand back up, even when standing hurt. Grief still lingers in the cracks of rebuilt walls, and silence still echoes in places that once rang with laughter. Of course it does. Within that silence lives memory, and within memory, meaning. Japan did not just rebuild, it remembered. And in remembering, it found the strength to carry on. Thank you for watching.